Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome everybody back and call this meeting to order. We have the Jason Didden show today for the most part. Hope you get comfortable up there, Jason. You're going to be there most of today. Before we jump into our first item on the agenda, I just want to recognize Sonny and Wes for their contributions to the reception last night. The seafood and everything was fantastic. We had a great evening. Weather was perfect. It couldn't have been any more perfect than it was. I was hoping it wasn't going to be 100 degrees and pouring down rain, which is what it's been here the last few days. But our award ceremony went very well, and I hope everybody had a really nice time last night. And also, I want to extend a thank you to Shelley for setting things up. She was running the show there last night, helping the servers and getting all the food set up to serve, and did a great job. So thanks, Shelley, for that. I'll just say this. So the state of Maryland is hosting ASMFC. Our ASMFC meeting, Bob, that's next year, I think, right? And I may have some folks reach out to you, Shelley, just to get some feedback on setting up, because we did the CCC meeting here last year as well. So we've got some experience working with the town of Annapolis and venues and caterers and things like that. So thanks so much for all that. And Bob, we'll have to start that conversation sometime soon. We don't have much of a team here to put that together, but we'll get there. We'll figure it out. Okay, with all of that said, let's go ahead and turn to the first item on our agenda. This morning, we're going to be getting a presentation and taking a look at Atlantic Mackerel's 2024 and 2025 specifications. This will be similar to what we've done over the past day and a half with board from ASMFC on other species. So I want to turn things over to Jason to start the presentation, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. Before I begin, I just wanted to kind of highlight in the cover memo, because of the change in status to no longer overfishing for the first time in 35 years, according to the new assessment, that triggers in some processes additional peer review. So the SSC's acceptable biological catch recommendation was preliminary, which means the action today by the council will also be preliminary to some degree also. The SSC is going to look at mackerel again in October after they get that now needed additional peer review. And so if their findings change, we may be back in December, essentially considering these same questions. Again, that's a bit of just an odd process thing. I think we've already had some discussions like, okay, well, we kind of understand and it made sense why mackerel is no longer overfishing because catch was a lot lower. So maybe we really don't need that process. Maybe it should be amended, but that's how it is right now. So folks are sticking with it. So anyway, that's just a bit of an overall that, we may be back here in December, especially if the SSC changes things after they see that peer review. So that aside, quick overview for today. It goes through some background, the advisory panel input, the SSC findings, the monitoring committee recommendations, and then you all will have at it. So a bit on the management summary side, just to kind of set the scene. This FMP has been around for a long time, 1978. We have 3 limited access tiers. Tier 1 has no trip limits initially. Tier 2, 135,000 pounds. Tier 3, 100,000 pounds. The Tier 3 boats also have a small, kind of a relatively small subquota. The idea when that was set up was, okay, those tier 3 boats, they don't land often, but sometimes they do land large quantities. So let's give them a relatively large trip limit, but a relatively small sub quota. So they can kind of get shut down. They're not going to take a big chunk of the quota, but that's why we have that tier 3 with a relatively high trip limit, but a relatively low sub quota. They've never actually reached that sub quota, but that was the intent in setting that up. There's an open access / incidental permit that when the fishery is open normally starts off at 20,000 pounds. There continues to be kind of some different perspectives out there. Is that an open access permit that I should be directing on mackerel? Is it really incidental? If you look at different sources, it's described different ways. It's mostly incidental, but there is some small scale directing that takes place with that permit. Then all those trip limits are kind of phased down as the quota is approached. There's also a river herring and shad cap for the mackerel fishery. Hasn't closed the fishery in recent years, but in 18 and 19 did close the directed mackerel fishery. So where are we right now? 2023 specs, about 8,000 metric tons. We set about 2 aside for rec, 2 aside for Canada. That's just how the FMP works. We set aside expected Canadian and rec catch. There's not much commercial discards that's deducted, and the remainder is the commercial quota. And then, you see here these before and after closure thresholds. That's just what I was talking about before, that phases in some trip limits. So we try not to overrun the quota and also not end up in a situation where we have a really low trip limit that's going to cause a lot of discarding. So where did that 8,000 metric tons come from? This is the rebuilding path that we had hoped to be on, and we'll discuss later. We're unfortunately not. But that 8,000 metric tons for 2023 was kind of the first in trying to rebuild the stock by 2032. That was just the projections coming out of the last stock assessment. And again, it's kind of a similar process as we might see with some of our other species, but not similar results, unfortunately. So a bit just kind of long-term history I like to flag. In the 70s, you can see that big foreign fishery that was phased out eventually. There was some joint venture activity in the 80s before that was phased out. Since roughly 1990, it's been just U.S. and Canada making up the landings. So I just kind of superimposed this last stock assessment findings. It's that line for biomass on top of those catches. And you can kind of see that there's this match of, we've seen these kind of pulses of recruitment that the fishery has caught and led to higher landings on those pulses of recruitment, but an overall very downward trend for the stock. Wasn't always perceived that way. The historic assessments were really inaccurate. And the kind of thing that I kind of keep including to remind myself of how far off we were, the 97 mackerel catch limit was about 10 times what we now think the entire spawning stock biomass was. That's how far off we were with this stock. In 2005, looking at 2003-4 data, at that point, we still thought things were okay. In fact, we thought the stock was at its highest ever. 2009-10, we had a joint assessment with the Canadians, and like the models weren't quite working. The Canadians were getting different things. Like we didn't know exactly what was wrong, but there were indications that something was wrong. 2018, we had the benchmark stock assessment that more or less figured it out by integrating both the Canadian egg survey and our egg survey, that the stock was overfished and we'd been overfishing since the late 80s. Unfortunately, the 2021 and 2023 management track assessments, while the projections, you plug in typical recruitment, expected catches, the stock looked like it would rebound, but we really haven't seen much change. So this is stock status to 2022 that in the assessment document, and it's kind of a personal pet peeve that on these center stock assessment graphs, it's a floating axis. So if you just hand draw it in a line where 0 actually is there, it's a little clear of how low the stock actually is. That floating kind of axis kind of doesn't let you see actually how low the stock is, how close to 0 compared to where it was historically. And then this is F, fishing mortality, and you can see, again, 35 years of overfishing. Apparently in 2022, we ended that just barely. Canada closed its fishery. US rec catches were down a bit. Commercial catches were very low. So it's not kind of like an unexpected finding that F would have dropped a lot. But we've been off on our terminal year biomass estimates. So, if we're off again, who knows if that will hold. So as of 2022, just 12% of the biomass target, and again, just under overfishing limit related to those low 2022 catches. So a little more detail on recent performance, just landings and revenues. You can see that big bump up in the mid-2000s. It followed, I think, basically 1 year class, a big year class of fish. Both us and the Canadians fished that. Our landings collapsed, and then the Canadian landings kind of followed suit a few years after. Originally, we had kind of hoped that the fish were shifting north, but then eventually the Canadians kind of ended up in a similar position. Prices, long-term upward trend. I think that big jump in 2022 is probably related to the Canadians closing their fishery. But mackerel, especially in terms of export and prices, go into a world market. I think so our quota this year is like 3,000 or 4,000 metric tons. The European mackerel quota is like 800,000 or 900,000 metric tons. The European mackerel have been going gangbusters for whatever reason. Their quotas and landings have reflected that. To advance here. There we go. Just a little more on 22 landings details. So I have the stat areas are in there. It's mostly midwater trawl. That's usually what the bulk of this fishery is. Kind of a mix of some other gears also. Sometimes bottom trawl in recent years when landings have been low might kind of alternate with midwater trawl. But in terms of the bulk of those landings in last 20 years, mostly midwater trawl. Again, the states mostly going into Massachusetts and Maine last year. Just for a little perspective on areas of catches. So this I just grabbed from an old document where mackerel were caught in VTR data 2011 to 2015. And kind of, I just zoomed in a little bit here and circled those 4 stat areas where most of the catch came out of the last 2 years, just for a little perspective. So where landings have come out the last couple of years, is kind of typical mackerel areas. So kind of not unusual locations, but low. This is 2023 preliminary in blue here. So landings are already a bit higher, are about a quarter or a third higher than last year. A switch in terms of when they've occurred. Recreational catch in 2022 was down after being stable more or less from 2018 to 2021. This is just total catch, all modes, harvested, released. Most of that reduction in 2022 is coming from Massachusetts reported catch. So reported catch and discards and reported landings that the dockside interviewers don't put their eyeballs on. Probably adds a bit of uncertainty, given that reported catch makes up a lot of the mackerel catch in any given year. But nonetheless, there's a bit of overlap in those confidence intervals. So, it's possible it didn't, those were more similar, but it's still, with those barely overlapping confidence intervals, it probably is a statistically significant decline from 2022 to 2021. So that's a bit of background of kind of our overall management structure, fishery performance. We ask the advisors for their input each year, trying to get their on the water observations to feed into our SSC process. We also kind of flag our research priorities to them and kind of ask for input on those. So the kind of key summary takeaway from staff's perspective of the fishery performance report this year for mackerel is: one, demand remains strong for this fish. That's not a cause of low landings. There continue to be scarce in southern areas, but nothing really unusual kind of from an environmental observation perspective. They flagged that the inshore New England buffer, which no longer exists, but did for parts of 21 and 2022, and low herring quotas have served to dampen recent mackerel landings. Also noted that if we'd had a lower river herring and shad quota, we would have ended 2023 kind of prematurely from some folks' perspectives. And that is tied into, I also thought that the mackerel fishery earlier in the year was going to close probably in April due to the river herring and shad cap. Then we got some more observer data that had less river herring and shad, and it dampened all those cap estimates. So they stayed open, while earlier and before that new data came in, they would have closed. So folks were flagging that if the cap had been lower, they may never have gotten to those observer data that kind of let them keep operating. And then just also kind of a general observation from some folks that the fishery performance report seems kind of moot right now, given kind of the restrictions and criticism of the fishery doesn't let them catch the quota. There's also some discussion, some kind of concern about Canadian alignment. This has come up with, there's a fish size limit in Canada. They do have kind of allow kind of an undersized component of that fish, since they can't sort perfectly. And so there's a kind of interest in, concern about the gear that's used in the mackerel fishery, the small mesh midwater trawl, and how it kind of relates to what Canada does, kind of comes up each year. And then we talked a bit about that recreational catch also. Again, what might be a cause for that 2022 decline? Is the recreational catch a substantial impact on fishing mortality or not? Certainly, when you look at the history of the fishery, it's a very small component, but at these low quotas now is a more substantial component of catch. There's also a little discussion of, given some of the trip limits that just started in 2023 on the recreational side, and some of the states kind of potentially funneling more folks into their commercial permits, could that lead to some shift in reporting? Again, that would have just been for 2023. So we'll kind of have to kind of keep an eye on that in years going forward. Just flagging Canada, they have their own stock assessment. It's more focused on kind of the northern contingent, but they're evaluating a lot of the same data. They've closed their fishery in 2022 and 2023, and 2 kind of official Canadian correspondences were included. More or less, I think, requesting that the U.S. take a similar response as they've done of limiting catch. And I will pause. This is our SSC summary slide. Hoping Paul is on and can touch on these.
Yeah, I'm on. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, thank you, Jason. They did a great job of presenting the material to date and sort of the sort of procedural difficulty that we face in terms of our next steps here. So the SSC reviewed the level 1 management track assessment, which was a direct delivery, and that those data were updated through 2022. Now, of course, during this process, the update revealed that overfishing was not occurring, which again is a status change, and under the guidelines of the NRCC process, a level 2 management track assessment is required under that. So as indicated earlier, this means that all of the recommendations from the SSC are provisional, subject to potential revisions if the management track assessment comes to a different conclusion. Now, the SSC has spent a lot of time over the past few years looking at the Atlantic mackerel, and particularly the aspects of rebuilding. As Jason has indicated, that has not been very successful, and there have been a variety of reasons brought to the table as to why that is not occurring. But one of them, of course, is that the recruitments that have been estimated have typically not translated into larger numbers and biomasses of adult fish. So something is going on there. Either the model is overestimating those incoming recruitments, or there's some source of additional mortality that's occurring between recruitment and a fishable size. So one highlight of that is in 2022, the estimate of recruitment was higher than the median, and actually one of the better ones in recent years. However, in Canada, they had their third lowest on record. So there's a very strong mismatch between what their stock assessment model is predicting and what ours is. So there is this discord that weighs into any of the projection process, as well as estimates of stock status. So Kirsten Curdy at the center, the lead scientist on this, took a look at some alternatives for projections, and the basis for the projections that the SSC considered were the results of a sensitivity analysis. And if it is assumed that the 2022 year class is equal to the median value, the F rebuild, that is the magnitude of fishing mortality necessary to rebuild by 2032, is it changes from 0.11, which is very low, of course, to 0.07, which is extraordinarily low. And just going through the calculations, that is expected to have a 61% or an equivalent probability of rebuilding by 2032. Now, the SSC, of course, expressed low confidence in this projection, in the sense that not because of its technical merits, but because, you know, we just recently haven't seen that those levels of recruitment. Now, there was an enormous amount of discussion by the SSC, the stock recruitment relationship, and so forth. You know, is it still valid? Can we really expect to see those large year classes in the future? There's some concern that the 30 years plus of overfishing may have changed the composition of the resource, or their environmental change may have been reducing the habitat suitability for mackerel in our area, and so forth. So that's also kind of on the table as factors. But if you look at individual fish, as Kirsten said, you know, there's really no change in their condition factor, that is how plump they are for a given size, and the ratio of recruitment to spawning stock biomass has actually been going up. So even though the stock sizes are very small, they're producing more which is what you expect under certain types of stock recruitment relationships. So with all that being said, this projection, the recommendation for ABCs of 2,722.6 metric tons in 24 and 3,900 metric tons in 2025 are conditioned on this revised assumption about the magnitude of the 2022 year class and all of the updated estimates of year class strength that occurred when the model was updated in this year. So these results are provisional, but for now they stand until the management track review. The SSC did recommend a focus on the residual patterns. You know, that there might be something revealed there that kind of a larger group investigation might help identify. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jason. Appreciate the time.
Thanks. And I've had some discussions with folks in recent weeks about like how is it possible we were so far off historically? And I mean, essentially the old trawl survey was maintaining or increasing in catches. And so the earlier models looked at the catch that occurred. Survey seemed to be doing okay, so it thought those were okay. And that's kind of the short answer to that. Once we got the egg survey data, it became more clear that the albatross was not reflecting mackerel biomass. There was something going on there with distribution or availability, and it gave us kind of the wrong signal. And really, when you look at that at the stock figure, it's really been a 50-year process of decline. So I was thinking about it last day or two, that 50-year decline and only occasional periodic big recruitments, even though when you run through the projections, we still say, oh, it looks like we can rebuild in 10 years. In the context of a 50-year decline and only occasional really good recruitments, I can imagine a scenario where it's going to be a long haul to actually rebuild the stock, even though the projections indicate it's possible. So we'll see what happens. Stephen, can you click on that screen again? I seem to have. There you go. Okay. So from the SSC's upper limit on catches, the monitoring committee met and kind of following the process in the FMP, trying to figure out how much do we need to deduct for Canada, given the Canadian management decisions of late. The 74 metric tons of landings from them for last year seemed reasonable, even though recreational catch was down a bit in 2022. You only have to look back 5 or 6 years, maybe, where we see some recreational catch of as much as 4,000 metric tons. So to avoid kind of blowing things up in future years, the monitoring committee kind of recommended just staying where we're at for recreational catch deduction, despite the slightly lower 2022 catch, and then 115 metric tons for commercial discards. So keeping the recreational catch and the commercial discard deductions the same. So the remainder is what is available for commercial landings. And that works out to 394 metric tons for 2024 and 1,568 metric tons for 2025. So really, there are no good options for how to deal with that, given kind of how this fishery operates, with only 394 metric tons for landings. But based on landings patterns in 2022, after the monitoring committee meeting, because we're kind of still chewing on this, GARFO statistics quota monitoring staff were able to project, okay, if we look at what happened in 2022. Change the bigger trips to these smaller trips, what would we have gotten for landings? And, you know, we had some back and forth via email. We had a couple, you know, the first runs like, you know, no, it's not going to work. It's going to result in too much landings. You know, any of these 6 options that are on the board here look based on 2022 data like they would constrain landings to the landings quota that's available. But, you know, there's going to be uncertain performance at these low quotas. We really haven't been in a situation like this before. And if you looked at 2021 landings, catches could end up higher. So I think where staff is at for recommendation right now is to, you know, set 2024 trip limits that appear they're likely to constrain landings. And even though the ABC is going to increase or would be planned to increase, just leave those low 2024 trip limits in place for 2024 and 2025, see how they work out in 2024, and then potentially modifications can be considered in 2025 if we actually get more ABC and if the trip limits kind of limited landings as expected. So council action, again, the SSC has to revisit the ABC in October after this kind of additional required peer review. And the SSC may look at it and say, okay, the peer reviewers, I mean, so the center can't do a lot more with the assessment. The assessment is basically done. Kirsten Curdy, our lead assessment scientist, she may be able to do a few other little sensitivity analyses, but the assessment is basically done. But we're going to get some more peer review on it. And so that peer review may impact the SSC's ABC determination. And, you know, the ABCs could go up or they could go down, or they may say, you know, where we are is about right. So we won't know that until October. The peer review's in late September. So we'll know that in October, not early enough for the October council meeting. So we'd have to deal with it in December. After the council deals with specifications, is also, I'll note, a staff recommendation for the council to request that NIMS take emergency action for this year. Using those slightly more pessimistic projections, as Paul was describing, not assuming that we get this big slug of fish from 2022 recruitment, that suggests that if we catch the full quota, we'll be back into overfishing in 2023. So staff recommends that the council request emergency action to mitigate that, go back to essentially kind of an old version of our step down 20,000 pounds trip limit for the limited access vessels, 5,000 pounds for open access, and trying not to create, you know, so the industry, you know, it won't have time because it's emergency action to adapt and plan. The idea is try to limit landings, but not create kind of a super unexpected situation where they run into mackerel and we create a lot of regulatory discards. Again, this is just the blue line there is 2023 landings to date. You can see we're already getting close to the point where some of the initial kind of triggers are set to lower landings, but they often wouldn't occur until October, November. And again, since when you look at those new projections, it suggests we could be back into overfishing in 2023. The recommendation is to kind of shut things down now where they are. So they're kind of summarizing, there are basically 3 kind of decision points and kind of motions or sets of motions for the council. 1, the basic 24, 25 specifications. 2, the trip limits, which are really incidental trip limits that would go along with them. And then a possible emergency action request. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your presentation, Jason. Paul, thank you for yours as well. Let me go to the council to see if anybody has any questions on the presentation. Are there any questions? Eric Reed.
Somebody was being proactive on my comments, I suppose. So, I just have a couple of questions. One is about the SSC's discussion. I mean, we're talking about no fish. As far as the commercial industry goes, there's no fish, and I realize that. But was there any discussion at the SSC about a 2-year average for 2024 and 2025? I mean, if I do my math right and assuming that it would not be a pure average, it would probably be less than a pure average because of recruitment and all this other stuff. And it would really come down to, a few £100,000, given that the numbers that I see here right now, it's a 20%. The commercial industry is going to get 20% and the rec's going to be allocated 80% of the fishery. But, I'm trying to turn crumbs into croutons here. So my question is it possible or not too much of a problem, even though it's no real amount of fish, to have the SSC examine a 2-year average? That's my first question.
Jason?
Take a shot and then Paul can weigh in.
Sure.
Sounds like he was queuing up also. So there was some discussion of an ABC that was very close to the average. And again, it just really still only allows incidental landings. But the problem was the SSC, well, a couple issues, but one of the main problems was that the SSC didn't have that particular number run out in a projection to determine that it would still meet the council's policy choice of a 61% likelihood of rebuilding. So they said, we don't have that analysis in front of us. We do see that these numbers will maintain that council policy choice. So that's what we're going with. So I think the council, could probably request that the center, when they're doing their projections, include something that's, close to a 2-year average and would still rebuild the stock with a 61% probability by 2032. And then I think the SSC can, and also ask the SSC to, consider that as ABCs for 24 and 5. And as you mentioned, since you have a little, if you average it, it's a little more catch early on. That kind of sets you, all else being equal, that sets you back an infinitesimal bit, but a little bit. So it wouldn't be quite an average, it'd be near average, and then probably lowered a tiny bit to still account for that and maintain the expected rebuilding trajectory. So I think the council could ask the center to do it. I don't think it's a hard thing for them to do, and then the SSC to consider it.
Right. Yeah, and I think Jason has described it very well. The other thing to note, these are of course all kind of razor thin margins, something somewhere between crumbs and croutons, I guess. And the other thing is that we will be meeting, the SSC will be meeting with Kirsten in our September 13th meeting day to kind of get an update on this, and also to reflect on some of the potential projection scenarios that might be appropriate. So there will be another bite at the apple, so to speak.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Din and Dr. Rego. I appreciate that. I mean, I know it's some amount of work for nothing, but maybe I can get panko instead of just a really fine breadcrumb out of it. So, my second question is about when we talk about trip limits. I think the observer coverage threshold is 20,000 pounds, and I'm not sure if that that's the mackerel fishery or the herring fishery, but if observer coverage is something we want, you would have to set a trip limit at higher than 20,000 pounds. I guess that's my point. If in fact there's is there a threshold there at 20,000?
think SBRM is just distributing observer coverage based on gear types. And so I don't think a trip limit in the center or Garfro could weigh in, but I don't think a trip limit will affect whether or not a vessel gets observer coverage.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I guess my last question, which is not going to be all that popular in with some people in New England, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So, according to my simple math here, which might not be exactly right, but I think it's pretty accurate, 80% of what we are going to have to split up is going to go to allocating the rec fishery. And I believe that the trip limit per person is 20 fish possession limit right now. So my question is, what would happen if that trip limit would go to 10? And the real question is, is having the commercial fishery with no directed fishery and almost no fish, is it fair and equitable to consider going to 10 fish for the rec fishery as opposed to maintaining 20? So that's it.
I mean, based on the analyses in the last macro rebuilding action, yeah, well, it wouldn't reduce recreational catch by that much because most of the recreational catch is occurring on trips less than 10. But you would expect some reduction. I think given the kind of public interest in the recreational trip limit observed last time this was revisited, staff would probably recommend that that be considered kind of separately via a framework so that people are kind of more aware and clued in that that was kind of on the table.
Okay, thanks for that. Are there any other members of the council that have any questions for Jason or Paul? Okay, seeing none at this time, I'm sorry, two hands just went up. I'll start with Peter Hughes and then we'll go over to you, Michelle. Peter?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. I don't have any questions. I was going to say that I have 1, 2, 3, 4 motions that I'll be bringing forward based on our presentations here today. So just want to let you know that. Thanks.
Okay, I'll come back to you here shortly, Peter. Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, whatever we approve here today is really just provisional, like we will revisit this. I'm just thinking about the question that Mr. Reed asked with respect to requesting another set of projections. It would be something of an average. So if the council were to do that, the SSC would be able to review those in September. We would come back in October, take another look. I mean, we have to do that anyway, just because of the change in status. So but we still need to approve something here today for 2024 and 2025.
Yeah, I mean, so once we kind of got the assessment results and knew we'd be in this bind, we discussed with Chris, what's the best path forward. And, since we'd already had to notice things and things might not change, kind of the conclusion was kind of press forward, set with what we have, and then adjust later if needed.
Okay, thanks for that. Anyone else? Jason?
And I mean, I think staff's plan was to work with the center on requesting essentially an averaged projection. So I think that will happen probably unless the council doesn't think that's a good idea, then you could instruct staff accordingly. But I don't think you need a separate motion to that issue. I think that's kind of already planned via staff to staff discussions.
Michelle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just one more question. I know, you had recommended in the staff memo, the monitoring committee couldn't find justification to change, the recreational set aside and, the question that Eric asked about changing the recreational bag limit. I'm just curious if given that most of those that is occurring in state waters, has there been any outreach to the New England states to see if that might be something they might be willing to consider.
Yeah, having kind of, and the focus of the monitoring committee was kind of, with the FMP inspects, setting aside enough to cover the expected recreational catch. I think if the council wanted to pursue, potential changes to, the council wanted to pursue changes to recreational measures, yeah, that'd be a kind of a separate effort that has not been initiated.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Seeing no other hands at this time, let me see if there are any questions directly to the presentation from the audience. Anyone out in the audience? Greg?
Greg DiDomenico, Lunds Fishery. Lunds Fishery is just, I think, one question to staff or to the executive director. I won't bore you with the story, but in 1999 and 2000, the agency urged the domestic industry to invest heavily in this fishery based upon what was going to be a 1,000 metric ton U.S. fishery. I'm sorry, 100 metric ton fishery split between another 100 metric tons in Canada. So we invested heavily upon that science, if you will, and to the tune of about $60 million between four companies. I'm trying to be brief and quick, sorry. So now that we're in this situation, which is, I could easily call a disaster, the industry is going to be pursuing a disaster declaration for this fishery. And that would require support from this council, support from staff. And I was really just here to respectfully request that support today. And that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Maybe we can get some comment on that at some point. Chris Moore.
Mr. Chair, we'd be glad to help as we go down that path. Certainly, I would expect there would be some staff support for that. I'm not sure exactly what else that's going to entail, but certainly we'll work with industry folks to do whatever we can.
Thanks, Chris. Seeing no other hands in the audience, I'm going to go to the online hands. I've got Mike Wayne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mike Wayne with the American Sport Fishing Association. Jason, can you just review the recreational catch data for me for this species? I think we've discussed this before. There's some integer bias, I believe, in the data. And then also, can you just remind me, what is the assumed release mortality and what is that release mortality based off of?
So again, a lot of the mackerel catch, both retained and discarded, that's reported. Discards are always only reported, but I don't know that it's quite so often we see so much of the harvested catch being reported. I'm not sure whether that's people using from the bait at sea, people having a lot of fish so they don't want to bother having the counters of the dock bother with, whatever it is. You have a lot of reported catch, and I think is not infrequent the case with that reported catch. Yeah, you see a lot of integer digit bias, 5, 10, 20, 50 fish that, you see these peaks in there. So there's definitely some integer digit bias in there. The fact that the numbers are reported and not observed adds more uncertainty. What were the other components of your question again?
Yeah, so what's the breakdown between harvest and discards?
It's
And what
mostly,
is the discard mortality rate assumed, and what is that based off?
yeah, it's mostly harvest, discards, and Kirsten, I don't know if you have it handy for the most recent year of what percent of recreational catch is discards, but it's 100, I think it's relatively small, but it's assumed 100% discard mortality. I think that that's assumed for lack of having anything to base it on. And Kirsten can correct me if I'm off on that.
This is Kirsten. No, you are correct. We assume 100% discard mortality. Give me 30 seconds and I'll pull up the numbers for 2022 as far as what proportion is in each category.
Just to follow up while Kirsten is looking that up. So if Atlantic mackerel are swimming around in a live well and a recreational angler releases those fish into the water, they're assumed to die. Am I hearing that correctly?
If they reported it as released fish, yes.
Thank you.
And I don't think it's more than 20% of total fish caught are released, but Kirsten will have that momentarily.
I believe for 2022, it is 12%.
Is that in line with previous years?
Oh, that will take me a couple more minutes. I'm sorry. Give me a couple more minutes and I'll get there. I'll be right back.
Yeah, I think as Kirsten, I'd say don't worry about it now. I think it's usually between 10 and 20%. And if that's not the case, we'll follow up offline.
Yeah, that works for me. We don't need to be running around running spreadsheets and things right now while we're trying to make decisions. So thanks, Mike, for your questions. With that, I'm going to bring the conversation back to the table. Peter Hughes has a set of motions that he would like to begin with. So Peter, I'll start with you and we'll see where we get to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One comment first on the possession limit of 20 fish up in New England. I attended all of those public hearings. I believe we received correspondence from the state of Maine and New Hampshire, or Massachusetts and New Hampshire, to a request to hold public hearings up in New England. And we held, I think, 5 public hearings up there. Might have been 4 and might have been 1 webinar. Very passionate, very well attended, and very passionate. So I would say that if we're going to revisit, I don't think we can revisit it on the fly. I think it is going to have to be some sort of a official framework with notification sent out, and might also require another set of public hearings of some sort. But anyhow, with that, the first motion is the 2024-25 specifications. And my motion would read, I move to set the following for 2024-2025 Atlantic mackerel specifications. For 2024, ABC equals 2,726 metric tons. Canadian catch equals 74 metric tons. US ABC equals ACL equals 2,652 metric tons. Recreational set aside equals 2,143 metric tons. Commercial discard set aside equals 115 metric tons. DAH equals 394 metric tons equals DAP. JVP is set at 0, and TALF, total allowable level of foreign fishing, is set at 0. If you could scroll up. For 2025 specifications, We recommend an ABC of 3,900 metric tons. Canadian catch equals 74 metric tons. US ABC equals ACL equals 3,826 metric tons. The recreational set aside equals 2,143 metric tons. Commercial discard set aside equals 115 metric tons. DAH equals 1,568 metric tons, equals DAP, and JVP equals 0, and TALF equals 0. It's not a committee motion, Mr. Chair, so it would require a second.
Thank you for that, Peter. Thanks for the clarification. Do I have a second for this motion? Michelle Duval seconds the motion. Peter, do you want to provide any additional rationale?
I think that the presentation that Jason has given us is rationale enough, but you can see the difference between the 2025 and the 2024 ABC in that why we are talking about the possibility of asking the SSC to do an averaging to make those 2-year ABCs be the same, so that they're not different over the course of 2 different years. Just might make it a little easier. But no, that the presentation said it all. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Michelle, anything in addition? Okay, seeing her head shake no. We'll go ahead and ask for discussion on the motion. Mike Pentney.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. Can you scroll up to the beginning of the motion? I guess I'm just trying to get clear in my head the sort of process, given the discussion earlier about the fact that because this is a change in status, we have to go through a peer review in September and October, and then reconvene in December to discuss this. So I don't see that reflected in this motion anywhere, that like either these are preliminarily set pending peer review or any expectation of how the decision today would sort of set us up for another discussion in December. So I don't know if Jason or Peter can clarify the expectation with regard to that.
Jason.
We've had the SSC change ABCs before, I think. I think we could certainly note it in our press release, the expected timeline, whether or not it needs to be incorporated in the motion somehow. I mean, if we get a new ABC from the SSC, we'd have to react to it. So I'll leave that to you all to decide if it needs to actually be in the motion or not. But I think we would certainly note it in, press release and meeting summaries.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Yeah, and we're not far enough into the discussion here. I think we can, if we want to modify something slightly, I'd prefer not to have to read this back into the record again. Listening to it once was enough. But go ahead, Peter. What do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, thanks. Maybe it's something about pending future advice in 2023 from the SSC. We put this motion forward. Would that?
Works for me.
I mean, the only thing that I would say is put 2023 in there because that's what we're talking about. Even though it's for 2024 and 5.
Are you okay with that, Michelle? Does that satisfy the intent here a little more clearly for you, Mike?
I think so. I was just, I know there was a debate among the NRCC principals and the SSC about whether we needed to have a peer review of this assessment, given that the model didn't change and the data inputs and all that, nothing changed. And I lost that argument. I was hoping we could just take final action today, not have to go through this again in December, but, so this at least clarifies that there is the potential that something will change in December and we're not, that this is sort of a semi-preliminary, set of specs. So that's fine.
Okay. That sounds good. Let's see if there's any discussion on the motion. Seeing no discussion around the table, is there any discussion from the members of the public or the audience that are here today? Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Megan Lapsey-Freeze. I don't oppose the motion at all. I do, and I don't know what other motions Peter has ready to go after this. But I would request that, as Eric had suggested, the SSC review a potential averaged approach, as well as pointing out that to have a commercial quota for mackerel of 394 metric tons and a recreational set aside of over 2,000 metric tons is problematic from my view. I don't know if this council knows that in the state of Massachusetts alone, there are over 1,400 recreational mackerel permits after the last discussion that this council had. So I do think that recreational measures are something that are warranted to look at in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. You don't have the paparazzi following you around today. I notice. Getting famous to sign autographs after the meeting here today. Okay, is there any further discussion on the motion? I don't see any other hands online or from the audience, so I'm going to bring things back to the council. The council ready for the question? I'm going to choose not to read the motion back into the record, and nothing had changed other than the preamble to the actual motion as discussed by Mike and Jason and Peter. So therefore, I'm going to go ahead and call the question. Is there any objection to this motion by any member of the council? Seeing no objection, I will ask for the record. Are there any abstentions? Seeing no abstentions, this motion carries by consent. And we'll go ahead. Thank you for that. We'll go ahead and move on to the next. I need to step out for 30 seconds, so I'm going to turn things over to Wes here for a sec. Go ahead, Peter.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I do have a motion that's going to address the averaging for the SSC, but I think that the motion that I want to make next is we should address trip limit options. And, oh, here it is. And with these, we may want Jason to just, why don't you step us through these trip limit options again, Jason, if you can, and then let's put this motion up and have a discussion around the table on which might be best, if that's okay.
Stephen, can you go to slide 29 from the presentation? Okay, so how these trip limit options would work is the left-hand column there is how the fishery would start. January 1 would start at 20,000 pounds for limited access permits, and then there's some variability there for the open access permits ranging from 1,000 to 2,500 pounds. That's the first column. And the second column is a threshold to go to lower trip limits, because the analyses suggest that if you stayed at any of those limits that you start off at, which will, not perfectly, but which will cover some incidental mackerel landings, especially in the herring fishery. If you stated that, you'd likely overrun the quota substantially. So then at either 80 or 85% of the 394 metric tons, or the higher amount in 2025, you'd go to a lower trip limit of either 1,000 or 5,000 for the limited access permits, and either 250 pounds or 1,000 pounds for the open access permits. And the last column is what it seems like based on 2022 patterns, what you might end up for landings. This was kind of a late developing, kind of analysis to try to live with this, under this low quota. I think, any of these are potentially options. I'll note that the second to last one there, I think may have some advantages. I think going to below 5,000 and 1,000 is just likely to create more regulatory discards. It switches to that at 80%. So again, I think, didn't have a ton of opportunity to get a lot of input, but that second to last one on that row, I think does have some advantages.
Peter?
So we'd heard earlier from various people that this could be croutons, it could be panko, it could be crumbs. It's not even crumbs. And I'm going to tell you this right now. When I started working on a commercial fishing vessel in the very early 1990s, the fish hold capacity was 200 metric tons frozen at sea. This is that's less than 2 trips for the vessel that I worked on in the early 90s. So it's a very, very sticky situation. But I was going to put forth that number, that second one from the bottom, Jason, as a motion. And if Mr. Chair, I could read that into the record. Might have to give me the numbers as we go. For the 2024, 2025 trip limits, I move to set an initial trip limit of 20,000 pounds for limited access permits, and what was it, 1,000? 1,000 pounds for open access permits at an 80 or 85%? 80 was that second one from the bottom? At 80% of the quota, the trip, I guess scroll up, limits would change to 5,000 for limited access permits and 1,000 for open access permits. Sorry, that was a little disjointed, but I didn't have the numbers in front of me.
That's okay. Jason, or whoever's working on that, can you add pounds after 20,000 initially on the second line? Okay. I think we're clear now. So we have a motion made by Peter Hughes. Do I have a second? Sonny Gwynn seconds the motion. We've heard some justification, rationale behind this. Peter or Sonny, did you have anything else you wanted to add? Peter?
I would just say that, they're so low quotas right now that, and the percentage that we can't go over our ABC. If we go over our ABC, we have real problems. And this is hopefully going to prevent us from doing that. So that's my rationale for why we need to do this.
Okay. Sonny, anything else? Okay. Mike?
Just a question for Jason. Can you go back to the table, please?
Yeah, I cut and pasted, Stephen. If you just slide up in the motions, I think the table will be there, yes.
Okay, thanks. The one thing I noticed that, I don't know if you can explain or if it's just an artifact of the way the trip limits were set, but, looking at each pair of rows where the difference is the 80 to 85%, going from 80 to 85% results in a difference in landings, except for the last two lines, where whether we're at 80 or 85%, we end up with 372 as landings. And so I'm just curious if there's an explanation for why this set of limits going from 80 to 85% doesn't affect the outcome.
Yeah, it's a good observation. I think I'll have to follow up with Garfield Quarter monitoring staff about that. Always possible there's a transposition error in that. So I'm not sure. I agree. One might expect it to have some impact, and I'm going to have to double check.
Okay, and based on the trend, though, between the other options, the option selected, and that's part of the motion made by Peter, would be the lower of the two. So I would say that the error is more likely on the higher end, just given looking at the trends and the values. But yeah, if we can get a follow-up on that, Jason, that may not be right now, right at this point today, but is the council comfortable with moving forward with this, given the question raised? Yeah, seeing heads nod. Okay, if we can go back down, perhaps, Jason?
Yeah, and I see the same numbers in the analysis I received. So it might not be a quick fix to determine that, but we'll follow up and the council will be revisiting this in December anyway. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Okay, are there any other, is there any further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, does anyone from the audience have anything they'd like to discuss regarding the motion? Any comments? Okay, seeing none, and given that this was a work on the fly, a little bit disjointed, using Peter's word, I'm going to go ahead and read the motion back into the record for clarity, and then I'll call the question of the council. For 2024, 2025 trip limits, I move to set an initial trip limit of 20,000 pounds for limited access permits and 1,000 pounds for open access permits. And at 80% of the quota, the trip limits would change to 5,000 pounds for limited access permits and 1,000 pounds for open access permits. Okay, calling the question, is there any objection to the motion? Any abstentions to the motion? Seeing no objection, 0 abstentions, motion passes by consent. And I will go ahead and turn to Peter for perhaps another motion. Peter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're just rolling it up. Get it on one page.
So there are two kind of remaining questions.
Yeah.
One is, does the council want to specifically direct the SSC on the averaging and then the emergency action? So, Stephen, if you can slide, just that averaging there is just a placeholder. Thank you.
That's the one I was looking for. So I move for the council to request that NIMS take emergency action to limit directed mackerel fishing with trip limits of 2,000 pounds for limited access permits and 5,000 pounds for open access permits until the 2024 specifications are implemented.
Okay, thanks for that motion, Peter. We'll go back and revisit the SSC directive after this. Do I have a second for this motion? Second by Skip Feller. Peter, did you want to rationalize your motion?
Well, again, I mean, we don't want to be found in an overfishing position again, and without some sort of action, we could find ourselves exceeding the ABC and back in an overfishing position again. But I do have a question about timing of this whole thing, so, and that would be to the agency.
Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it's August. How quickly how nimble is the agency on its feet to make, to address something like this?
Mike?
Yeah, we have not proven very nimble in recent months trying to get actions out the door. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's, our team can get stuff together pretty quick. Getting things through headquarters has been a challenge, we'll say. I expect we could have this in place in October, which isn't ideal given that it's August now, but yeah, sometime in October.
I apologize for the workload that it's going to take, but exceeding our ABC and being found in an overfishing position again isn't very palatable either. So, so my motion is what it is.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Mike?
Yeah, two points. Just if I could get, just because the way it was, Peter, you read the motion into the record, you said 2,000 pounds for limited access permits, and I think you want to correct that so it's read into the record correctly that it's 20,000 pounds. The other thing is just to remind the council that because this is a request for emergency action, I have to vote no. It's not indicative of whether I support the action in concept or principle. Also, just letting the council know that when a request for emergency action comes to us, it's the secretary that makes a decision. We can agree with the council that emergency action is necessary, but we're not bound or limited by what's in the motion, so we could potentially do something different. Generally, we do look to for the advice of the council. But just want to be clear, when I vote no, that's why I'm preserving the authority of the secretary. And what you see at the end of the day might be different from what you've requested.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Peter?
Thanks, Mike. And Sonny also pointed out that I said 2,000 pounds and not 20,000 pounds. So I will very quickly read it back into the record. I move for the council to request that NIMS take emergency action to limit directed mackerel fishing with trip limits of 20,000 pounds for limited access permits and 5,000 pounds for open access permits until 2024 specifications are implemented.
Okay, and now that we have it clear on the record, is there any further discussion? Anyone from the public? Jeff Kalin?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jeff Kalin from Lens. I'm just trying to understand the difference between this motion and the one that was passed for the 2024 fishing year, where the limited access possession limit was 1,000 pounds. And now the limited access permit possession limit would be 5,000. I don't understand why it wouldn't be 1,000. I don't understand why it's inconsistent, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Peter?
Thanks for that, Jeff. And Jason, correct me if I'm wrong. This is 2023 we're talking about. These specifications are already here.
Right.
2024, we have different information. So the specifications are going to be a little different in 2024 and 25.
Yeah, but the logic would follow that there should be 1,000 too, if we're trying to halt things along the same lines of what we're going to be limiting them in the next year. Why, I, you know, I would, if I could make a motion, I'd change it to 1,000. I don't understand why it's 5. Thanks.
Jason?
Yeah, and it's 5 because that's what the original staff suggestion is, that's what the open access closes to now when mackerel closes. That's why it's that. If it was 1,000, catch would be a little bit less. I think, in terms of, so I don't think we're at a major risk of exceeding ABC. The problem is our ABC may still cause overfishing. And, based on past performance under these trip limits, you typically kind of get a trickle of landings in. So based on that, plus the fact that the current closure goes to 5,000 for open access, that's why that was the staff recommendation.
Okay, thanks for clearing that up, Jason. Anyone else from the public? Bringing it back to the table then, I've got Eric Reed.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. So now I'm confused. So if the emergency action is put into place in October, that means it will be in effect through, I think, April, so 180 days. But if in fact we approve specs in December that are different than the emergency action, which one is in charge? Which directive is in charge, the emergency action or the change in specs?
Mike?
Yeah, as soon as we publish the final rule for the specs, the actual specs, we'll rescind the emergency.
All right, thank you. Any other discussion? Okay, seeing none at this time. Is the council ready for the question? Is there any objection? One objection. National Marine Fisheries Service. Seeing it's not. So motion passes with 1 no vote by the National Marine Fisheries Service. Okay, Peter?
Okay, last one. Looks like I've got 6 minutes to get it done to maintain our timeline.
It's 5 minutes and 40 seconds, Peter.
Well, the motion keeps popping around and disappearing, so. Technically not my fault. We just burned 30 seconds.
This is like where they cut the wire. It's just gonna be incredible.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, there's nothing on the screen. Are you working on that, Jason?
Yeah, Stephen, you might need to slide down a little bit. There we go. So is this the one you were looking for?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Motion would read, I move to request that the SSC consider 2024, 2025 ABCs that are consistent, near an average result, and would still rebuild mackerel with a 61% probability. Something needs wordsmith there. It still needs a wordsmith.
I'm not sure what that wordsmithing looks like.
Paul said 61% probability. That's in there, Paul,
by 20.
by 2032. Okay.
Eric
Right.
Reed?
Yeah,
You can-
thank you, Mr. Chair. If you could put some sort of a when they're going to consider it, that would be great.
Jason, I believe that's October is the SSC meeting.
Thought it was September, but
The peer review is in September. The SSC is going to get a little pre-brief in September on kind of developments, but the actual reconsideration will be at their at an October meeting yet to be scheduled.
okay. Okay. Peter?
Okay, so now we have it ready. I'll read it back into the record if that's okay.
Perfect.
I move to request that in October 2023, the SSC consider 2024, 2025 ABCs that are consistent, near an average result, and would still rebuild mackerel with a 61% probability by 2032. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Do I have a second on this motion? Sonny Gwynn seconds the motion. Do we have a discussion on the motion? Seeing no hands, anyone from the audience? Discussion on the motion. Seeing none, we'll bring it back to the council. Is there any objection to the motion? Seeing no objection to the motion, are there any abstentions? Seeing none, motion carries by consent. Thank you, Peter. And I think you're good. You've got 2 minutes ahead of schedule. Is there anything else, Jason, is there anything else to come before the council at this time on this matter? Okay, Jason's shaking his head no. So let's thank you all for your participation in this discussion. Let's take 10 minutes, come back at 10:40 to pick up with the next item on this morning's agenda. Thank you. Okay, if everyone can start to return to their seats, we'll go ahead and get started again here in a minute. Okay, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and pick up this morning's agenda with a presentation by Jason on river herring and shad. My plan right now is to go through the rest of this morning's agenda and see what time that takes us to before we break for lunch. So I think some candy's been put outside and we got fresh coffee. I saw them just pour fresh coffee, so we'll hunker down and get through the rest of this morning's agenda, starting with Jason. Whenever you're ready.
Thank you. So two primary things for the council. One, going to kind of review the river herring and shad update that we typically do every other year. And then also consider AP input in committee motions originally for the CAP and other efforts. With there really being no mackerel fishery for the next 2 years, the CAP question may be a bit moot, but we'll deal with that when we get to it. This is a structure of the update. I'm just going to run through quickly each component. So CAP performance just last year and this year in blue. And we discussed a little bit earlier how I actually thought it was going to close in April, but because of that kind of additional observer information, it ended up not closing. This basically tracks the mackerel fishery, right? There's a ratio of river herring and shad CAP in the mackerel fishery. So when the mackerel fishery is operating, this ticks up alongside with it, depending on the ratio. The ratio last year was lower, and also there were low mackerel landings, so that's why the orange is so low there. It's just CAP performance over time, just added in the most recent years. So you all have seen this before. Again, 18 and 19 are in bold there. It's just the 2 years when the mackerel fishery was actually closed by the CAP. This table I think is useful. I'm not going to go into detail now, but you can kind of get a sense of the numbers of permits that were involved in the relevant fishery, how many trips were there, and kind of the ratios, and also the last one column, the observed trip, the number of trips that actually go into it. There's a procedure, if there's less than 5 trips, they use data from the previous year and then kind of merge in new data with the previous year data. Once they get to 5 trips, then you're just dealing with that year's data. However, if you never get to 5 trips, then the fishery can potentially be closed, as occurred, I think, in 2018 and 19, based on blended data. This has come up in the past. We had some in a previous iteration, some port sampling data, but I asked Garfo staff if they could break down, what were the fish that were going into the CAP estimates between alewife, blueback, and American shad. And see, in most years, it's mostly either alewife or blueback, but there was that 1 year in 2015 when most of it was American shad. It can bounce around a bit from year to year. Okay, so the CAP basis, originally it was based on looking at kind of a reference period and trying to, looking at the median interaction rate. And if the fishery could fish at or below that median interaction rate, it would operate without getting closed. If it was higher than that, then it would get closed, maybe a little bit early, maybe a lot early if it had a much higher interaction rate. In recent years, it's just been kind of locked in at 129 metric tons. That was that median rate applied to a much higher mackerel quota. But in the lower CAP amounts really increased some of the monitoring challenges. And I think it was kind of illustrated this year when, if that CAP had been lower, they may have been closed before those lower interaction rate observer data came in. So the council has chose to leave it at 129 metric tons for the last several years, despite the low mackerel quotas. So the center used to produce some catch tables of river herring and shad across all the gear types. Just with the transition to cams, which I do think is getting towards a better, more understandable, more documented data source for landings and discards, but we're still in a bit of a transition period. So I don't have, we couldn't update those tables because we're in that transition period. Again, we've got some new gear definitions and kind of making sure we're looking at apples to apples comparisons. But staff does include for squid, mackerel, butterfish, some rough estimates for those fisheries of interactions with different non-target species. SBRM is really looking at overall estimates of managed fish, while in mackerel, squid, butterfish, it's come up that, okay, that's nice information to have, but we're also interested in what happens in this particular fishery. So staff has developed some kind of, it's not totally dissimilar to what NIMS is doing. It's looking at bycatch ratios and expanding it, but it is not the official discard estimates. It's to try to get a rough idea of what's going on on this fishery. And so I included kind of an updated results for those for both Atlantic mackerel and longfin squid of roughly what they're catching for river herring and shad. It's, you know, it's kind of within the bounds of what we've seen in recent years, but those numbers are in the update. Also listed, the commission posts recent landings numbers for river herring and shad, and updated those figures that are up on the screen. I think it's important to note on those for river herring, almost all those landings are occurring in, excuse me, in Maine, shad, mostly North Carolina, South Carolina. Another table that we couldn't update as typical was just what kind of observer coverage have we been getting for different gear types. SBRM is kind of focused on looking at different CVs for different managed species groups in different fleets. So they have breakdowns of, you know, for small mesh bottom trawl, what do we see in VTR versus observed? So we couldn't quite update it the same way, but we do have the annual SBRM reports. They're basically able to piece together the same information. That's what this table does. The July 21 to June 2022 numbers just were posted yesterday or today. And SBRM just announced that. So it wasn't in the update, but I did add it just on this table here. So the main thing that I think is interesting from this table, one, you can see the huge reduction in observed trips due to COVID. You know, for example, for Mid-Atlantic small mesh, we went from 631 trips observed July 2018 to June 2019. From 2020 to 21, and it's the year there is something related to observer funding. So then we went down to 58. Now we've bounced back to 160 in that 21 to 2022 period. So this was when we were looking at, we talked about SCUP day before yesterday. When we were starting to look at that, staff wanted to get like a rough sense of how impacted were things by COVID. So we did a custom request to the center that I just copied and pasted into here of, can you show us for, and we gave them some specific coordinates, but basically Mid-Atlantic, small mesh and large mesh bottom trawl in Mid-Atlantic and Southern New England. And again, I think it just shows that the dramatic drop off due to COVID and kind of the slow increase since then. We also kind of, you know, when the council was at one point considering whether or not river herring and shad should be managed species, one of the discussions was, well, would we have some benefit for observer coverage if river herring and shad are managed species? So the center had done a similar analysis back in the day. We asked them essentially to do it again, a what if analysis, saying, what if river herrings were an SBRM species group? Does that change coverage? And, maybe it might give us some more midwater trawl coverage. And what might those trade-offs? Because we don't fund all of the observer days that we'd like to now. So if something gets covered, something is going to lose coverage. SBRM and how it allocates coverage is one of the more complicated things I've come across in fisheries management. What it's basically trying to do is for all these different fleets, like a fleet might be small mesh Mid-Atlantic, large mesh New England, some different meshes, New England and Mid-Atlantic gillnet. For all the different fleets, it's trying to get 30% or less CV, coefficient of variation, for each species group. So for example, SBRM wants like a 30% CV for combined summer flounder, scup, black sea bass discards in each fleet. Now, it's kind of in some respects, an odd way to assign observer coverage. That what do we really care about that the CV of combined summer flounder, scup, black sea bass discards in each of all these fleets are 30% CVs. However, when you run it through the assessments, this method basically gets us decent discard estimates for all of our managed species, even though the way it allocates is a bit arcane. The whole point of it and why it's so complicated is because there was a lawsuit that said you're not allocating observer coverage in a standardized way. So we came up with a very standardized way to allocate observer coverage to meet that lawsuit. It's very standardized, it's rather complex, but it basically says we don't have enough sea days to cover all of our targets for fish and turtles. So how are we going to prorate it out and pick which we are going to give coverage to and which we're not? And it kind of sorts through, okay, if we can't fund this fleet, what's the next fleet we could fund? It has this sorting process that, again, I still find it challenging to track, but it's standardized and it more or less gets us decent discard estimates for our managed species. So we asked the center if they could kind of run this. So it kind of had an interesting result, is that it shifted, when we did this, it shifted a lot of coverage into New England and into New England large mesh otter trawl, gained a lot of sea days. And it's not even necessarily that fleet catches a lot of river herring and shad, but when you start, there's this giant matrix of all these CVs and all these different fleets, and it changed that matrix a little bit, and because of that, it threw a lot of coverage, not even necessarily because of river herring and shad, but because of that sorting, standardized way to figure out if we don't have enough money to fund everything, what are we going to fund? The result was it put a lot of more sea days into New England small mesh and large mesh. Getting into more of the details than that would require a long presentation by the center, so we'll move on. But end result, midwater trawl didn't get a lot of extra coverage, partially because they don't discard river herring and shad. They retain it. It's kind of a weird situation that normally we see fish either in the landings or in observer data, but for river herring and midwater trawl, they're in the retained fish. They go wherever those fish are going, but they're really not recorded, so they kind of disappear. So I think staff plans to have maybe some additional follow-up with the center. Is there a way to get around that? Explore some, what if we just essentially recoded all the midwater river herring as discarded? And how would that change things? It may be more complicated than it's worth, but we're having some additional discussions of, are there some ways to extend this to provide some more information? But again, the big thing is that because of the complex sorting that SBRM does, it really didn't drive any coverage into any fleets that are probably really useful for river herring and shad, just because of how SBRM works. Okay. 5, 6, and 7 were kind of coordination related issues in the update. There was an old item in there. Have we aligned the Mid-Atlantic caps with New England? The council has previously decided that's not a great idea because the councils have just kind of taken some different policy choices on how they set the caps. So we haven't really pursued that. Did flag New England is looking at reconsidering the basis of their caps and reconsidering some time area closures. They had a midwater trawl inshore buffer area for a while that was thrown out by a lawsuit. They're kind of reconsidering that. So it's just kind of a thing to keep an eye on. Other coordination things, council staff actively participate in the services River Herring Forum. They just published a new conservation plan. There's a link in for that. The council has also funded a small little contract with MAFMC to kind of build out a run portal where whether it's a state or a citizen science groups could upload their run counts, because right now, I mean, when there's a river herring assessment, a lot of that data is amalgamated, but outside of that, it's really hard to track. You know, you'll see these news articles. This run was up, this run was down, and the idea was to kind of have a central source where everyone could put their run information in. And so MAFMC had kind of done a small scale of that for Maine, and the council provided some funding for them to build that out. That's just spinning up this summer with some grad students. And then a final, the SSC, the council has kind of considered SSC involvement before. The SSC hasn't really been involved, but has said, you know, if you have some science-based cap or something you'd like us to involve, to evaluate, we're happy to do that. But right now with our cap, it's more of a management-based cap rather than a science-based cap. Like our cap isn't based on, hey, that is a good number for river herring and shad. The number is based on, this will create some incentive for the fleet to avoid river herring and shad. So it's more of a management-driven thing than a science-driven thing. So the SSC hasn't been involved recently, but it's indicated they stand kind of at the ready if there's something for them to evaluate. Other actions by the council, again, the low mackerel quotas, even 2023 is a fifth of average 97 to 2022 commercial landings. That's going to limit impacts of the fleet on river herring and shad. And then we didn't know exactly what 24 and 5 were going to bring based on the Canadian assessment. We had a pretty good sense that it probably wasn't going to be great. So, but as long as mackerel stays in sense of de minimis fishery status, that will lighten impacts on river herring and shad. There's a river herring assessment going on right now. I think the review for that will be the end of this year or next year. They do have a bycatch cap term of reference to try to figure out, you know, can their assessment provide some more information on kind of an acceptable ocean intercept bycatch amount. We'll see what that comes out with. Shad had an assessment in 2020, so the update had links to those. As part of this update, staff also pings a bunch of state and federal and academic institutions that participate and calculate indices. So thank you to many of your staffs at the table, help out with that graciously. And that's an appendix in the update. And, you know, as is often typical, some of them are up, some of them are down. None of them really have great long-term trends. I'm not going to dive into any of them in particular here. Okay. Well, a few of them may have positive long-term trends, but I'll say overall, they don't have good long-term trends. Okay, a couple just other things that staff flagged. One, there was an interesting paper at the end of 2022 that kind of looked at that focal area just south of Rhode Island there. And we kind of really did a deep dive into the genetic origin for those species. So their estimates in terms of numbers of river herring and shad were pretty much in line with and the back of the envelope isn't the right word, but rough approximations in previous council analyses. But they did provide kind of a pretty neat deep dive into what rivers that bycatch in that period from 2006 to 2010 was coming from. And then the other study, Roberts et al. 2023, that they were looking at trying to predict, you know, bycatch risk areas looking at environmental data in the trawl survey, and some interesting results there. Had some preliminary discussions with them of, okay, so you found that there's, these relationships between environmental data and occurrence in the trawl survey, but what about like layering bycatch observer data over that? Does that kind of seem to match where the fleet has hit high bycatch spot in observer data? And where is the fleet landing their fish? And is there potential to kind of layer in a bit more data onto that to identify a method to kind of more dynamically predict bycatch risk areas? And so that kind of leads into the staff recommendation in the update. Given that genetic data, and it seems even if the river heron assessment kind of comes up with some good, a reasonable bycatch, acceptable bycatch number, it's going to be very challenging year to year to know, what runs are they coming from, and on the regional kind of stock structure basis of river herring, is that a workable number? And so I think, it's instead at the current time anyway, it seems like there's a bit more promise in trying to advance some of that time area risk work, environmental data. Not that that is necessarily going to provide an answer, not that it may provide an answer that's implementable by the service, but it seems like kind of the most fruitful way of trying to maybe kind of provide some more useful information on river heron and shad bycatch than trying to nail down a cap that in any given year works for the different regional population structures of river heron and shad that we see. So we had an AP and committee meeting. Some highlights, that summary is in the briefing materials, but some highlights that we got from that is that the council should consider river heron and shad migration from Canada when they're doing these things. And you did see in that genetic analysis, you did see some Canada fish, as been seen in much older studies. Not mostly, but you see some in there. There's opposing views from the AP on changing the cap. On one perspective is the mackerel quota is really low. The river heron and shad cap should be low also to keep kind of incentive on the fleet to avoid river heron and shad. Versus the opposing view, it's already relatively low. And if it's any lower, we're liable to get in a situation where fishery closes before we get a lot of in-season data on how it's operating. Opposing views from the AP on just what are the impacts of bycatch, and kind of the two sides there mostly are, one hand, there's been a lot of terrestrial or habitat work done in streams, open up habitat, but they haven't seen some of the expected gains. That puts more of a focus on the bycatch issue. And then on the other side, it's still not clear, like, exactly how much of the bycatch contributes to overall mortality and the overall depleted status of river heron and shad. Concern is noting that the time area closures have been kind of looked at in the past and were not deemed viable. Last we kind of the council thought about it, but again, from my perspective, there's a bit more information that might be worth trying to explore. Concern about wind farm impacts, both in terms of shifting the fleet around and could noise issues essentially create like a fence to river heron and shad migration. And then the observation that we've talked about already is that the low mackerel quotas are likely to limit impacts on river heron and shad. So there were two motions from the committee. The committee did recommend lower river heron and shad cap. And I think that's to some, you'll see in the materials, I think moot given the situation with mackerel. And then there was also a motion from the committee to that when the council is considering 2024 priorities to kind of consider ways to push the envelope on some of those risk modeling approaches. And I think this summarizes what I just said, and I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Any questions for Jason? Okay, seeing none in the room or online by members of the council, any questions from the audience? Seeing no questions, so if we can go back a slide, Jason, or two, and Peter, maybe you can help me here. There were two committee motions.
And this would be Sarah, Riverhead, and Chad
Oh,
committee.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry. Sarah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As Jason indicated when he was going through his presentation, the two motions that passed committee, one was the move that the council adopt the 89 metric ton river herring and shad cap. As he also indicated, with the low quotas, that may be a moot point, but the committee did approve that motion, so I presented on behalf of the committee.
Okay, we have a motion on behalf of the committee. And I will look for, there's no need for a second. So does anyone have any questions or would like to discuss this motion? Are there any implications in doing this, Jason, with staff recommendation? I'm just trying to understand what the consequences would be.
Again, we were kind of in, a tricky timing thing, given the sequence. I don't know exactly what the Roberts rules would be here, optimal kind of procedure, but I mean, essentially, I think the council could do a substitute motion to suspend for the time being the Riverhead and Shad cap because there's no mackerel fishery, or I don't think it can be withdrawn since it comes from the committee. So probably just a substitute to suspend until for the time being, given the lack of a mackerel fishery.
Okay, so that would be an option to consider here. I'll look to the council to see preference. Does anyone feel strongly enough to? You have a question, Chris? Go ahead, Chris.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Jason, if we approve this motion, it's really just kind of in place. It's not going to affect the fishery in the next 2 years, assuming that, further analysis, the assessment doesn't come up with, much different results. It would just be there, but really wouldn't be impacting anything, right?
And there may be some, if it's there, it would have to be kind of built into NEPA documents. And there so I think it would be simpler. I think it would be simpler if it was, well, because even if it's suspended, then it still has to be kind of removed. Yeah, I don't know what exactly the simplest optimal route, but in essence, with no mackerel fishery, it is a moot question, given the decisions just made. Maybe an amendment that the council could indicate support in principle for this to be kind of reconsidered, later when there's a mackerel fishery. Maybe on service, do you have any suggestions of an optimal simple path?
Yeah, I was getting ready to go there. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, the most efficient path is just to leave the catch cap status quo. Because then we don't have to do, the specs package doesn't need to speak to it. No NEPA analysis. We don't have to touch the regs or in rulemaking. So that is the cleanest path. Because, if we're reducing it, there's got to be some justification in the specs package that Jason provides explaining why this is the best course, but we acknowledge it's symbolic, if anything. We would need to address it in the regs, take comment on it. Same thing suspending it. We're not really suspending it. We would be setting it to 0 in the regs, or removing the reg that establishes a catch cap. And that's going to be complicated, and, that's going to encumber the rulemaking process. So I think from an optimal and most efficient perspective of trying to get the specs package through and published as soon as possible, just leave the catch cap status quo, recognizing that it's effectively irrelevant if the maximum trip limit is 20,000 pounds.
Okay, thanks for that thought, Mike. So I'll look to the council to see if there's an interest in perhaps providing a motion to substitute the committee motion. Sarah?
Question, clarification. If the committee voted on this motion and it failed, the existing cap is 129 metric tons. Would that remain in place, or does it have to be set essentially every year?
Yeah, it would remain in place. Like, it doesn't expire with the end of the specs. It's just, Jason, does it not roll over?
We do have rollover. I can imagine there's going to be some little nuances in our NEPA documentation, but I definitely agree with the service. Probably, given it's not of consequence either way, the simplest thing is probably just to substitute to just maintain status quo for herring and shad, given the mackerel decision.
Okay. There's a little confusion, perhaps. Just trying to make sure that we get this clear and correct. Peter, your hand's up.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of heartburn about this all the way around, but it's not going to, we're 20,000 pound fishery is not necessarily directed fishery. For a 100-foot boat to go out offshore and fish mackerel, it might be 20 cents is not a directed fishery. And based on the advice that I heard here at the table, I would move to substitute to a status quo river herring shad catch cap of 129 metric tons. I believe those are the correct numbers.
I believe so as well. So we have a motion to substitute for the committee motion.
I get a second, I'll provide some rationale.
Yeah, do we have a second for that motion? Joe Semino seconds the motion. Go ahead, Peter.
So in the documents, the lower mackerel quotas, it's going to be inefficient to monitor a very small catch cap, especially since catch estimates may change substantially in initial observer trips as data enters the system. So I don't know how many observed trips we're going to get, but it's going to be very difficult to monitor a very small catch cap quota for the mackerel fishery.
Joe, did you have anything to add?
I think the RA, Peter and Jason all covered it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the one thing that just needs to be clear here, and based on the record that we've already established, I think it is clear. It's not, the council's intent here is not to raise the cap from the recommended 89 metric tons, but more so to be more efficient through the process with the service, so that the extra work doesn't have to happen in light of the work that we did this morning earlier, and the fact that the mackerel fishery is not necessarily, as Peter couched it, not necessarily a directed fishery at this point. So I'm comfortable where we are right now. Are there any other discussion on this motion? Seeing no hands, let me just check online. Eric, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's okay, Mr. Chair. I'm used to it. Other than I would prefer the term postpone indefinitely, I support this motion and the rationale by previous speakers. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eric. Anyone else? Okay, seeing none, is there anyone from the public? Okay, seeing no hands from anyone in the audience, I'm going to bring this back to the council. The motion is moved to substitute to a status quo river herring shad cap of 129 metric tons. Is there any objection to the motion? Are there any abstentions? Seeing none, motion carries by consent. Thank you very much.
Now it becomes main motion. I think you just have to do it again as
That's
main
correct.
motion.
Yep, sorry. So we're going to get the main motion back up there. Okay, motion is I move to adopt a status quo river herring shad cap of 129 metric tons. Is there any objection? Yeah, Chris is asking me, should we specify the years here? Peter?
We can specify the year for 2024, 2020.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. It'll make it more clear. Okay, I'll read it again. For the record, I move to adopt a status quo river herring and shad cap of 129 metric tons for 2024 and 2025. Is there any objection to this motion? Seeing no objection, are there any abstentions? Seeing none, motion carries by consent. And I believe, Madam Chair, there's another committee motion to come before the council.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. As Jason indicated in his presentation, some of the new reports that are out with Roberts et al. And looking at river herring bycatch and the risk modeling, the committee felt like they wanted to call attention to that and possibly get it on the 2024 priorities discussion. So on behalf of the committee, this motion was passed. Move to recommend that the council include in the 2024 priorities discussion particular consideration of exploring a modeling for shad and river herring bycatch avoidance approaches.
Thank you, Sarah. We have a motion on behalf of the committee. It does not need a second. Is there any discussion on this motion? I don't see any hands from any members of the council. Is there any discussion on this motion? Does anyone from the audience have anything they'd like to discuss? Okay, seeing no one from the audience, we're going to bring it back to the table. I'll ask one last time, any discussion? Is there any objection to the motion? Any abstentions? Seeing no objection and no abstentions, this motion also carries by consent. Thank you very much. Jason, is there anything else that needs to come before us at this time?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We're a little bit ahead of schedule. But I think we can jump right into the last item on this morning's agenda. We have a presentation. Gray Redding is with us, Fisheries Conservation Program Manager with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. He's going to be discussing electronic monitoring and reporting grant program topics with us. So we'll give you a couple minutes, Gray, to get yourself set up and ready to go, and then I'm going to cut you loose. Looks like you're ready to go. Okay, whenever you're ready to start, you can start.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me today, taking some time out of your busy schedules for me to share some information. I know I'm standing between everybody and lunch, so I'll try to be quick, but also give Mr. Didden a break from the hot seat. I'm Gray Redding with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, or NIFWF. Today, I'll be talking about some of the fisheries grant programs we have at NIFWF, especially focusing on electronic monitoring and reporting. Walk through a little bit of history about the program, impacts that the program has had on fisheries in the Mid-Atlantic and other areas of the Atlantic, and then go through some information on how to apply for the funds in the future to address the needs of fisheries in this region and continue some of the program's impact. Yeah, so just to flag there, coming definitely to talk about this as an active grant program. We just released our request for proposals earlier this week. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's all available on the NIFWF webpage, and proposals are due October 16th. Some information about NIFWF. We were created in 1984 by a congressional charter. We're an independent nonprofit that seeks to leverage public investment and private sector dollars as well to maximize conservation impact of those dollars on the ground. Our focus is on voluntary work with communities and impacted groups, focused again on increasing that conservation action. And we do not fund or work in sort of the areas of advocacy, lobbying, or litigation. We work really closely with NOAA and other federal agencies in partnership, but we're not a part of those agencies. NIFWF's fisheries programs are an example of some of that partnership with NOAA. So we began the Fisheries Innovation Fund in 2010. It was started in response to kind of changing management actions, especially the introduction of catch shares across the United States. Program works from the basis that fishermen and fishing communities are some of the key partners and have some really important ideas or to find solutions and innovations to some of the fisheries management and conservation problems that they themselves are facing. So since 2010, the program has supported almost 200 projects with more than $35 million. In the Mid-Atlantic region, $1.8 million has come to support 15 different projects. Map here shows just sort of the distribution of those projects around the Atlantic. In 2015, given some of the increased focus on electronic technologies as a real tool for improving conservation and data collection in fisheries, we began making focused investments in electronic technologies like electronic monitoring, electronic reporting, and other data-focused sort of work that goes on in the background. These investments have sort of, as a proportion of the total dollars reported then, reported on the previous slide, since 2015, $28 million of that has been focused on these electronic projects, with $1.2 million coming to the Mid-Atlantic region. So the map here shows similar data, but from 2015, where those projects have been located, both sort of the electronic technologies focused projects in blue, and then some of the more traditional Fisheries Innovation Fund projects. So these have been practices that address bycatch reduction or marketing assistance for fisheries in addition to the electronic technologies work. So dots on a map don't tell the full story. So just jump into some example projects that we've had both in Mid-Atlantic and the Atlantic in general. So EM, or electronic monitoring, has been a really large area of funding, supported projects from a variety of grantees, including nonprofit groups, research groups, and in universities, and then fishing sectors and fishing groups themselves. So examples of the work, we have Gulf of Maine Research Institute that has worked with, since 2016, worked with 7 sort of large trawl vessels in the groundfish fishery to identify how electronic monitoring can work in that kind of fishery where you have a lot of fish moving and you need to have really efficient catch handling. That's helped and sort of work to demonstrate this tool as a means to increase accountability in the region and also enhance quota utilization in some situations. Also examples of electronic monitoring working on smaller boats. So example of the project was in 2016. Gettysburg College researchers worked to trial small, very modular and mobile electronic monitoring systems in the North Carolina pound net fishery. So they worked with one boat to demonstrate that EM can work to provide cost-effective information on catch and discards in this fishery and in other fisheries where kind of the constraints of the boat and characteristics of the fishery maybe aren't as conducive to onboard observers. So there's a large number of other projects that have worked with small-scale fisheries as well to demonstrate that same outcome. So some continued work in this area. Electronic monitoring and some of the feedback we often receive is around the costs, and those are both kind of the monetary costs to start up and operate some of these programs, but also the costs of fishermen's time and energy to be a part of designing these programs and actually doing the catch handling. So working to develop systems that help address those costs, and also bringing in new tools like artificial intelligence that can make the processing of this large quantity of video and image data go faster and be more efficient so we can use that data for decision making. Electronic reporting is another big area of work that we've supported. So since 2010, NIFWF has had 7 projects in the Mid-Atlantic region working with recreational, for-hire, and commercial fishermen, all focused on electronic reporting. Example is a 2013 project by Maryland Department of Natural Resources that trained and worked with 70 commercial striped bass fishermen in the use of electronic reporting tools that had already been sort of implemented and developed for fisheries in the state. This worked as early efforts to identify how these tools could work and how they could effectively engage commercial fishermen in using these tools. Just to note, I think through kind of the hard work of grantees and councils, both Mid-Atlantic and others along the Atlantic, gone from really early stages of developing these applications to electronic reporting being the standard along much of the Atlantic coast. Another example of a project is Virginia Institute of Marine Science that's working with recreational anglers around the Chesapeake Bay to develop and design a recreational fishing application that allows some sort of effort and catch reporting information that can really feed into stock assessments, but is also really focused on driving fishermen engagement by sort of offering helpful tools to them, helping with fish ID and understanding of regulations, and also allowing contribution of their data to more university research projects. So this has been, again, really focused on driving fishermen engagement with these tools. It's just one example of the recreational work that has been supported with, again, some of those other applications being more focused on sort of the statistical information that's needed to feed into management and decision making. So some of the next steps for electronic reporting that we hope to support both in the region and around the country, enhancing sort of the easy use of these applications, making them work better and make more sense, but also sort of meet all of the multiple regional requirements that fishermen may have to report to different jurisdictions, sort of in an easy and one-step process. And also continuing to bring some of the advancements that have happened in commercial and for-hire fisheries to recreational fisheries. So you have sort of the high-quality, timely data that we've developed in other sort of sectors of the fishery and can help with management decision-making. So these last couple slides have been talking about sort of the tools that have come into place to collect data, but just as important is some of the tools that are tools and systems in place to make sense of that data in a timely and meaningful way and get actual decision-making information into the hands of managers and fishermen and fishing businesses themselves. So all of that's sort of grouped into what we call data modernization. This is a common element of many of the projects that we support through this fund, but is even the sort of raw focus of a couple of projects that I'll talk about. The one is Sea Vision Consulting that worked in 2018 in New England with a wide variety of projects thinking about electronic monitoring to integrate and understand how artificial intelligence can be integrated into the electronic monitoring video review process. So one of the biggest costs there is actually getting trained technicians to look at that data and look at that video and pull the kind of fish interaction data out of it. So if we can use artificial intelligence and machine learning to kind of help focus that reviewer's time on some of the most important segments of the video when actual fish is in the hands of a crew member or moving across the sorting table, can help streamline that process. Another example is Moat Marine Lab doing work in the Gulf of Mexico reef fishery. They're exploring how EM data can be tied to kind of oceanographic and other ocean condition and location information to allow improved decision-making for the fishery, whether to avoid a certain patch of the ocean because it's going to be tied to higher bycatch or small species catch that would need to be regulatory discards, and also having that information feed into management systems for the fishery. So this is an example of taking kind of the data that's coming in through the stream and really using it to enhance decision-making and find a new use. Some of the next steps related to data modernization, continuing to understand where and how artificial intelligence can be integrated into the process to find more cost-efficient and time-efficient methods, and also identifying other tools and sort of outputs from these data streams, like what Moat's doing to increase kind of efficiency and accessibility of data and how it can impact businesses. So we're a conservation-focused organization, and part of that includes trying to measure the outcomes of our work. So in early 2021, NIFWIF completed a survey of Gulf of Mexico reef fish fishermen and New England groundfish fishermen to understand how innovations, including electronic monitoring and electronic reporting, were spreading across the fleet, kind of moving from just general awareness to actually being adopted into fishing businesses and becoming the default for some of these businesses. So these regions were selected just because of the kind of strong and continual history or steady history of funding, so allowing us to have a higher chance of seeing some meaningful impact from the support. So to understand these, we ask questions, again, around kind of fishermen's awareness of these tools in their fishery, and if they were aware, had they adopted them into their business. So starting with electronic monitoring, we saw sort of a middling level of awareness of the tool with approximately or less than 30% of commercial fishermen being kind of aware of the tool and aware of how it's useful to their fishery. And then amongst those who were aware, so really only less than a quarter of those had actually adopted these tools into their fishery. New England adoption rates were slightly smaller than Gulf of Mexico adoption rates. So some of the concerns that fishermen raised with this, there are issues of privacy, sort of having these cameras and long-term ability to see into their businesses, and also obviously the cost, both again, time to work within these systems and learn to use them, but also the financial cost to start up and operate the systems. So other area that we asked about was electronic reporting. Survey responses here showed high awareness of the tool for both recreational and for-hire fishermen, greater than 50% amongst all groups, with New England fishermen, both again, recreational and for-hire, having stronger awareness. And we also saw strong adoption. So approximately over 50% of folks that were aware had adopted the tool in New England across both of those sectors. And in the Gulf of Mexico, it was closer to 40% of the for-hire and commercial groups had actually adopted the tool. So this and these survey responses, again, were collected in 2021 before some of the larger scale requirements for electronic reporting were brought on in New England and other regions. But demonstrates that NIFWIF grantees and other groups have been doing effective work to build these tools and engage fishermen in their use and understand how they could benefit. So these are lessons that we can take from kind of Atlantic fisheries and potentially help to drive engagement in the Gulf of Mexico or other fisheries. Again, given an overview of the past and some of the progress that the program has driven, we'll want to remind folks that this is an active program. So application window opened up earlier this week. There's actually an error on this slide. October 16th is the due date. And the larger sort of information about the program is available at that link there. But I'll give some other contact information you can get if you had questions or wanted more information. Throughout the sort of request for proposals, we expect to give $3.8 million in funding. This is a chance for both kind of new groups to come in and start to understand or receive support for better and enhanced data collection in their fisheries, as well as existing groups that have received support to continue some of their important work. So specifically around new applicants, we've engaged a fisheries liaison that I'll provide some contact information before or later. And so that can help kind of those new groups identify and understand some of the requirements of the program and really engage effectively in the application process. But if there are problems your fisheries are facing that better data or faster data can help with, definitely want to invite people to apply, and I can address some of those questions. So the funding priorities of the program separated into two kind of major buckets. For those that support the sort of actual on-vessel collection of electronic data, whether that's implementing new hardware for electronic monitoring, expanding or improving electronic reporting, both the applications and also their use, and just generally projects that drive engagement with data collection for all kinds of fisheries groups and sectors. The second bucket is projects that look to modernize the tools and systems that are in place for fishing businesses and management groups to make sense and use data. So examples of projects in here would be those that enhance the ability to get this data into decision-making processes or find new uses for data, like what I talked about with MOAT's project, really allowing changes in fishery behavior on the water. And also projects that help to continue reducing costs of this data collection process and improving the timeliness and again, accessibility of the data. So these priorities are driven largely by NIFWIF's partnerships with NOAA, but also driven by the electronic technologies implementation plans that the council and sort of regional offices are involved in writing and updating with headquarters. So that just gives a little information about how we raised into this. And if you did have project ideas that don't fall into this, we're glad to discuss, because again, we really do favor kind of what are the regional priorities and what issues are you all facing that we can potentially help with. So as you're thinking about kind of project concepts that fall into those priorities, I want to talk a little bit about some of the key elements in these proposals. So partnerships are really important, both with fishermen. Some of the best projects that we see have fishermen sort of involved from the ground floor and driving the work, or at least engaged very early and continuously throughout the process. So the systems can be built in a beneficial way to those groups and really establish trust in the data that comes out. Agencies are another big group. So electronic monitoring or reporting often, but not always, are sort of part of the process to meet an agency's data requirement needs. And so as you work, again, with fishing groups to understand how they can benefit, suggest that it's helpful to talk with federal or state agencies to ensure that the data that's being collected has a home in those management systems. Another important item, these are technical, sort of experimental projects with new technology and new tools. And so want to see a team that has the experience to make these things work. So encourage folks to partner with experienced groups, and also groups that have the experience to kind of share the lessons that they've gathered from their project in a way that can benefit other fisheries that may be interested in the solutions, or other regions that could also adopt them. And then finally, these are federal funds that we're awarding through the partnership with NOAA. And so there are the financial requirements around sort of managing and working with federal funds that grantees need to be aware of, especially kind of being registered and actively in the federal government's standard award management database that just shows your ability to handle and contract with the government, and also having audits and other financial paperwork in order. So we can definitely help address questions around that and what those requirements are. So I have just a couple kind of thought-provoking, hopefully, questions to come back to this slide, but also don't need to talk about them today. Just invite folks to think about them if you have kind of follow-up conversations or have an idea about a project that's brought up by this presentation. So those questions, just what kind of electronic technologies projects would maybe be helpful for your region or your fishery? Are there management areas or fisheries where you don't have enough data, or that data isn't necessarily on the time scale that you want it? And also, are there electronic monitoring or electronic reporting tools in other fisheries or other regions that you've heard of and are interested how they could apply here? And with that, thank you all again for listening today, and thanks also to the partners shown on here that have supported this work, as well as the grantees that have been integral in kind of getting the on-the-ground work completed. On this page is contact information for myself on the top, and then our field liaison, Willie Goldsmith, and as well as a link to the program's page where the request for proposals is accessible now, along with a number of resources around kind of those financial documents and other kind of application processes that are beneficial for applicants. And you can also, again, reach out to myself or Willie, and we can steer you towards all those documents and help out however's needed. So with that, again, thank you, and I'll take any questions or comments.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. A lot of good things to chew on there. I was happy to see that um, there's an engagement in the recreational community, not just on the commercial end, converting paper reporting to electronic reporting. We had a discussion earlier this week about just the inaccuracies and while the program that estimates catch for on the recreational end does the best they can, there are lots of flaws there still. And we talked about it earlier this week, and it's nice to see that there's an effort being put into collecting necessary information to help us all do our jobs a little bit better in the future. So with that said, let me look to see if any members of the council have any questions or comments they want to direct to Mr. Redding. Dewey Hemmelwright.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for your presentation here. I believe that, the electronic monitoring or the way that we produce data is vastly needed. But also wonder what your universe of commercial fishermen left up and down this coast that you're going to subsample. You gave an instance of your pound net fishery in North Carolina in 2010, 13 years ago. How many pound netters are left, do you know, nowadays in North Carolina that does this? And I just wonder about all this data-driven stuff. What's eventually the outcome? Because if you looked at probably since 2010, and you looked at the number of commercial fishermen left up and down this coast, it's drastically reduced. So your universe to spend all this millions of dollars to get data possibly from the commercial is going to be a lot smaller subset of what it was 13 years ago. And I realize that you're a data-driven nonprofit, but I just wonder, how do you take that in consideration that your universe is getting smaller and smaller to do these projects, and the other avenue is probably getting larger and larger, the recreational end, and we don't see that want for really massive data-driven on the other sector that's harvesting the resource that could help as you talk about being about conservation and stuff. So how do you weigh that, or does that even come into the equation of the effect of what you're looking for in different ones that request money to do these data things, which is needed?
Yeah, so these are competitive grant programs, so we're really constrained in only being able to fund the applications and sort of proposals that folks come to us with. And certainly recognize that graying of the fleet and other kind of commercial, other forces are acting on the commercial fishery to change those dynamics and impact them. And I mean, the program was originally started to give an avenue for those fishing groups to identify the problems and hopefully have a little support to identify what potential solutions are. So in being constrained by the applications that we get in, we don't have kind of that direct agenda or advocate for specific points, but support whatever the fisheries come to us with needing support on. And in terms of recreation and recreational data collection, definitely excited to see that. I think we've gotten some really strong, as I showed, kind of both awareness and adoption of these tools in commercial fisheries, and hopefully they've resulted in some good data collection and decision-making tools for groups and bodies like this, and hope to see kind of that continued data quality rise from recreational fisheries. But we need to see the applications come from those groups, and so need to see, yeah, that sort of from a grassroots level.
Okay, thank you. Next, I have John Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation. Great. My question kind of follows up on what you've done in North Carolina and Hawaii, I believe it was. We are mostly small-scale fisheries in Delaware, and I was just curious if you could just give more details. I know Dewey just provided more information on that, but what was actually done? Is it still continuing? And then is this a standard one-to-one match with these grants?
Yeah, so our grants traditionally have been a one-to-one match. We do this year have a limited pot of funding to help with certain applicants and certain applicants that are working with maybe communities where it's harder to find those matching funds to help with that. And so encourage, if you do have questions around kind of ability to support match, glad to have those conversations. In terms of the pound net fishery and some of the small scale fishery work that was included, again, we don't have that much compared to some other regions. The Mid-Atlantic hasn't subscribed to this fund as much as kind of New England and the Gulf of Mexico and Alaska. So was pulling from a fairly limited number of examples to really try to tie it home, but tried to raise with that this was a pilot study really proving can these tools collect data in a fishery where actually having an onboard observer is economically or logistically challenging. And it's been proven in multiple fisheries that these tools can supplement that data collection and really help small scale fisheries where boats maybe don't have the bunk space for an observer or can't sacrifice that, or it just doesn't make economic sense to bring those folks on. So the pound net fishery is not one that we've had continuing projects and interest from, but raised it as an example of work that's gone on here in the past and gone on as a proof of concept and helped out other fisheries.
Just, I mean, how were they electronically entering their catch data? Was it done by phone, or was there a device given to them to enter the data?
Yeah, so electronic monitoring specifically is having a camera on board that records the video collection, and then that video is reviewed back on land. And so imagine if you had the same eyes of the observer, but the observer was sitting at a desk instead of on the boat. And then a lot of times those tools are paired with electronic reporting to make all the time scales work better. You can process that video data fairly quickly, and so it really helps to not have then the logbook data be super delayed because of data entry or paper issues.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one more question. Sonny Gwynn.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. Really interesting stuff. And excuse me, as soon as this technology gets better and better, I'm sure this will get better and better. But has there been any talk about expanding it? Like, we have wind power coming up, and with this electronic monitoring, that perhaps we could monitor the windmills to make sure that, say, they're not killing any birds. Maybe we could expand it to the ships, putting it on ships to see for the whale strikes, and expand this to other places that besides the commercial fishing and recreational fisheries.
Yeah, so I think directly kind of supporting projects that are using these tools in those windmill areas would be outside of the scope of this funding, but I think they've provided a proof of concept that these cameras can collect data in a variety of situations, and you can process that data efficiently, especially with something like artificial intelligence, where a species showing up on that map may be a rare occurrence. So it's hard to pay somebody to to fast forward until they find the one instance a day. But again, that's outside of the scope of what we'd support. We do have within the Fisheries Innovation Fund, sort of the larger since 2010 umbrella of fisheries support, just added a new program that kind of all houses in this same idea of working directly with fishermen and fishing communities that's focused on the entanglement issue with North Atlantic right whales in New England. And we're continuing to explore whatever problems people are facing. We can have conversations about them, but some of them may fall outside of the scope of where these dollars can actually go.
All right, thank you very much. I don't see any other hands at this time. So therefore, what I'll say is, Greg, thanks for being with us. It's great that you ended with a slide with all your contact information and information about the program. I personally am fascinated with the artificial intelligence piece. Although I grew up watching movies like The Terminator, and I can't think of one without the other. So it's until I can get out of that headspace, it's difficult to think that the computers are going to take over someday. But I thank you for being here, and we'll certainly reach out. We'll let everybody get an opportunity to kind of think about what you presented and chew on it a bit. And we'll reach out if we have some other questions for you. But thanks.
Thank you for having me, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Council.
All right. Have a good rest of your day. We're going to go ahead and break for lunch. We'll come back in an hour at 1 o'clock, and we'll pick up then. Thank you.